Thanks, Claudia. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Durban and Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center teams for their help always in making sure that these webinars are the success that they are. Just a quick word of apology from Tally Nates, who is unlikely to join us. She's visiting her mum, who she hasn't seen since 16 months in Israel, and she's just got out of quarantine today, and her mum doesn't seem to be so well, so she's asked for us to please excuse her, and she would try and join us if she can. I am personally very, very thrilled that we've got this webinar together, and I wanted to thank Menachem so much. Menachem Rosensaft is a personal friend through the World Jewish Congress. Menachem is the General Counsel and an Executive Vice President of the World Jewish Congress, and I've become friends with Menachem. He is the most incredible human being. He is an intellectual, he's an academic, he's the adjunct professor of law at Cornell Law School. He's also teaches a course in the law of genocide at Columbia University Law School. But more importantly, he is the son of two very significant Holocaust survivors, Wiesel and Hadassah Rosensaft. I speak as if I know them or I knew them, which I sadly didn't. But for many of us, we've participated in recently quite a few webinars around the liberation of the camps, and in particular, the liberation of Bergen Belsen. And many of those speakers who we've had have referred to the role played by Menachem's parents in fact, saving the lives of many of those survivors, despite their own personal trauma and difficulty as being survivors themselves. So it's a unique privilege for us to have this opportunity to engage with Menachem in conversation. He's going to give a short presentation, after which he and I will have a conversation, and then obviously we'll open the chat for people who I'm sure are going to have a number of questions themselves. Menachem has been, well, in 1994, President Clinton appointed him to the US Holocaust Memorial Council. He was reappointed in 1999. And in fact, President Obama in 2010 appointed him for a third term on the US Holocaust Memorial Council. He's been described on the front page of the New York Times as one of the most prominent of the survivors' sons and daughters. He has a lengthy and impressive CV, but I want you to meet and get to know my friend Menachem, the survivor's son, who's done so much to provoke awareness of the Holocaust, the warnings from history, and to play his part in doing what he can to fight for the rights of human beings in contemporary society today. So I want to say welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us for what I promise you is going to be a special evening. To say thank you to Menachem once again for making time out of your busy schedule. To tell you that he did send me a copy of his book, Poems Born in Bergen Belsen. The book is available through Amazon, US Amazon, and UK Amazon. And Menachem has very generously offered to post us another couple that we'll have it in the Resource Center in Johannesburg and Cape Town, so that the people can learn the book and have a sense of it. The poems are incredible. And I just want to share one last story. Menachem and I were at the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And Menachem organized a very intimate ceremony at in the camp, where he recited a poem in particular about his brother who passed away, was murdered at the age of 5. And I've never forgotten that moment. The poem is in the book, and I so look forward to you getting to know Menachem and the stories and his incredible capacity to document through poetry the unspeakable in incredible words. So without further ado, let's have Menachem, and then we'll engage in a conversation a little later.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for this most generous and lovely introduction. And it's indeed a pleasure for me to be here, both with the two centers, and especially to be here with you and to share this program with you. And I very much look forward to our conversation afterwards as well. Let me begin with a poem, which is one of the poems I actually did read when we were together in Auschwitz-Birkenau in January of 2020, before anybody knew that COVID was going to be part of our international lexicon. It's called Meditation on a Ghost Child. He drifts aimlessly through the snow, above the snow. The ghost child does not know who he is, who he was, if he was. He does not speak, cannot speak, and because he no longer knows how to speak, refuses to speak. He cannot understand, cannot recognize, cannot hear words, laughter, screams, certainly not prayers. He will not sanctify, glorify, forgive, curse. He does not know how many minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years he has drifted aimlessly through the snow, above the snow, drenched by rain, scorched under an August sun, over grass, flowers, like the flowers he saw before, but always between, decaying wooden walls. He no longer remembers a smile, a hug, a kiss, only faint echoes of a lullaby. Another ghost child walks toward him, beside him. They do not see each other, do not touch, no matter. They know they once heard the same lullaby, became the same ashes, dissipated into the same grayness. Two ghost children drift aimlessly through the snow, above the snow. In 1949, not long after the gruesome reality of the Holocaust had burst onto the world's consciousness, the philosopher and social theorist Theodor Adorno famously observed that writing poetry after Auschwitz was barbaric. Nach Auschwitz ein Gedicht zu schreiben ist barbarisch. Less well known, but equally insightful, was Adorno's subsequent conclusion, expressed in a 1966 radio address in Germany, that Auschwitz itself constituted nothing less than a relapse into barbarism, end quote. Adorno understood that the Shoah's calculated, systematic savagery was an absolute deviation from the fundamental norms of civilization and civilized behavior. To be valid, anything written or said about the Holocaust, whether in poetry or prose, must first and foremost encapsulate and reflect its barbaric essence. Aesthetic sensitivities and considerations must yield to the undeniable absolute evil that sparked and perpetrated the genocide of European Jewry, requiring us to absorb and try to come to terms with the unprecedented, the unfathomable, and above all, the inexplicable. Perhaps the most cogent context for this inexorable immersion into the unknown was given by my late teacher and mentor, Elie Wiesel, who once explained that, and I quote, Auschwitz signifies not only the failure of 2,000 years of Christian civilization, but also the defeat of the intellect that wants to find a meaning, with a capital M, in history. What Auschwitz embodied had none, end quote. And yet, despite all these flashing yellow lights, I, the son of two survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen Belsen, who was born 3 years after the end of World War II in the displaced person camp of Bergen Belsen, long ago turned to expressing myself in poetry. Over the decades, I've tried to give voice to the dead in my poems, to comfort ghosts, and to provide a memorial to the millions who have none. For me, conceptualizing my poems is often simultaneously a refuge and an escape. An escape from the realm of conventional human experience into a parallel internal reality, and a refuge where amorphous, phantasmagoric thoughts and images emerge sufficiently from the nebulous twilight to allow me to express them, however inadequately, in words. I cannot pinpoint the exact moment when I first began expressing myself in the genre of poetry, but I'm reasonably certain that my doing so was connected to my reading or rereading Dylan Thomas. The Welsh poet intrigued me with his ability to capture emotions rooted simultaneously in anger and pain. His A Refusal to Mourn the Deaths by Fire of a Child in London conveyed the anguish inherent in remembering a child killed in the German Blitz air attacks on London during World War II. Reading the lines, "Never until the mankind making," "Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter," and "The majesty and burning of the child's death," forced me to think of the children murdered in the Holocaust, whose death and burning in gas chambers and crematoria were anything but majestic. Again and again, I returned to this one poem until decades later, I've crystallized my reaction to it in two poems of my own. Whom should I forgive? Why should I forgive? How can I forgive? I wrote in A Refusal to Forgive the Death by Gas of a Child in Birkenau. And in Oh Yes, I Too Refuse to Mourn, I made the direct connection between Thomas's dead child and the more than 1 million murdered Jewish children cast into immortality of mankind's making at places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Belzec, and Majdanek. These children haunt me. In particular, the image of one child haunts me, and I never want him to leave my consciousness. Ever since I can remember, I've looked at a framed photograph of a little boy with dark hair, sharp, intelligent eyes, and a serious demeanor, looking straight ahead into the lens, seemingly through the lens. My mother rarely spoke about my brother, but I'm certain that she looked at this picture every day of her life. It wasn't until I read the manuscript of her memoir shortly before she died that I found out about her last moments with her child. It was the night of August 3rd to 4th of 1943. My mother, her parents, her first husband, her son, and her sister had arrived at the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp after a harrowing journey from their hometown of Sosnowiec in a cattle car. "We were guarded by SS men and women," she wrote. One SS man was standing in front of the people and he started the selection. With a single movement of his finger, he was sending some people to the right and some to the left. Men were separated from women. People with children were sent to one side and young people were separated from older looking ones. No one was allowed to go from one group to the other. Our 5.5-year-old son went with his father. Something that will haunt me to the end of my days occurred during those first moments. As we were separated, our son turned to me and asked, "Mommy, are we going to live or die?" I didn't answer this question. My brother's death and his absence in my life have been a recurring presence in my poems. Since my mother's death in 1997, he has existed inside of me. I see his face in my mind, try to imagine his voice, his fear as the gas chamber door slammed shut, his final tears. If I were to forget him, he would disappear. This is the background against which I wrote, "Oh yes, I too refuse to mourn." Oh yes, I too refuse to mourn the death of a child cast into immortality of mankind's making. Among weed-covered crumbling bricks and rotting barracks, he played with other shadowed, invisible children like himself, while a frozen wind blows ashes into melodies only they can hear. He was born, I was born. Our mother hugged us years apart. We turned 1, then 2, then 4, then 5. But he was never 6 years old, never was called to the Torah, never kissed a girl, never studied Ecclesiastes or Kierkegaard, never read Buber or Kafka, or even The Little Prince. Unlike London's daughter, they did not feel the flames that faded them as black cloud into the synagogue of heaven. Child souls choking on their own now toxic breasts, who did not suffer for God, for us, for any reason. Oh yes, I too refuse to mourn. The horrific circumstances of my grandparents and brothers being sent to their deaths led me to write the poem Selection, August 1943. Snarling dogs drooling at the mouth tear blood-soaked flesh from a still breathing, still howling, almost carcass, sleep unbathed, fornicate in their own urine, and are more godlike than the spotlessly uniformed, Mozart humming, Goethe quoting, oh so clean-shaven and always polite son of a Hausfrau, MD, PhD, Heidelberg, if you please, who inspects his prey one after another, with a bored smile after another before dinner. And then, in Psalm 121 on fire, I addressed God on my brother's behalf and mine. Black eyes search for yesterday, above beyond walls, above beyond shadow fragments, above beyond imagined hills. Search for human divine help, promised shelter, amid rags, corpses, vomit. Mommy, are we going to live or die? His last words to our mother. But you, who would be my brother's guardian, be at his side on paths he never got to walk. Slumber as the sun murders with your heat, the moon with its indifference. Sleep while atonal melodies bereft of life ascend from their depths through charred skeletal trees, and one more 5-year-old soul shatters unprotected into flames raging up toward your sky, your stars, your forever. My poems allow me to at least try to confront God in the aftermath of the Holocaust, without meaning to be either presumptuous or sacrilegious. I focus on certain biblical evocations in the context of what we know to have been the gruesome reality of the mid-20th century. Many of us are familiar, perhaps all too familiar, with Psalm 23, a standard at funerals. A Psalm of David, Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not want. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. In the psalm, God makes us lie down in green pastures and spreads a table for us in the presence of our enemies, anointing our heads with oil. Only goodness and loving kindness shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall live in Adonai's house forever. How can we reconcile these soothing words with the agony endured by Jews, as well as Roma and others, in the Nazi death and concentration camps? In response, or perhaps better, in reaction to this question, I conceived of an alternate version in Psalm 23 at Auschwitz. A psalm to the emptiness. No shepherd, only foes. No festive table, only bitter soup, moldy bread. No green pastures, only blood-drenched, rat-infested mud. He is always hungry. She is always cold, their heads anointed by blows, shadows walking through the valley of death, Adonai's fog-wrapped house forever. And then in Psalm 13 post-Auschwitz, and then there is Psalm 13 post-Auschwitz, where I again try to reconcile faith in God with the reality of the Holocaust. You hid your face, ignored your world, while flesh-fueled flames pierced the sky. Ashes not dew covered your mornings. Dying children saw your back, did not hear your voice. They trusted in your faithfulness, even as they entered your final sanctuary, even as they inhaled your poisoned breath, even as they began to sleep the sleep of death. You can never restore luster to their eyes, and I no longer wait for your deliverance. It is too late. My poems, by definition, are Jewish, but not exclusively so. Agnus Dei or Agnus Dei is Latin for the Lamb of God, a term used by John the Baptist to describe Jesus as effectively a sacrificial offering to God. In sharp contrast, my poem, Agnus Dei, is meant to evoke not martyrdom, but defiance. An infant disappeared, led into the gas, and a flower began to grow. 1,000,000 roses, red, one for every child, covering the field while shouting to the stars, "No, we are not yet dead." They wait, similarly reaches into Christian imagery to give voice to a reminder of the Holocaust's anguish. Forgotten on road rebuilt with ashes, they wait, child ghosts of twilight. Humming voiceless melodies last heard accompanied by Zyklon B hiss. Mary cried for her son, but not for other mothers, sons, daughters. And still they wait, child ghosts dominating God's final request against skeletal trees in fire sleep. Jesus, voluntary sufferer, meet a 5-year-old night angel who did nothing to deserve the agony of dying for your sins, murdered by the blood pure, baptized in, never ejected from your church. And still they wait, child ghosts of whirlwinds, suffocating in darkness, after the door slammed shut, after the air turned sour, after all prayer ceased. To return briefly to Adorno, the relentlessness of the barbarism to which he referred in connection with writing poetry about the Holocaust fades when I write about the present or the future. 2 of my poems reflect the identity of the survivors' children. The second generation. True, we are the children of a nocturnal twilight, the heirs of Auschwitz and Ponar. But ours is also the rainbow. In us, the storm meets sunlight to create new colors as we add defiant sparks to an eternal fire. And then night fragments. Night fragments created in fire shadows. We are the last and the first. The last to taste ashes from the cursed centuries valley of unwilling passers through, where God revealed his face to them alone. And the first, transfixed by still burning yesterdays, to reach beyond heaven and its clouds, beyond crimson ghost delusions, into ourselves, imploding. A second through the air, I'm sorry, beyond crimson ghost illusions into ourselves, imploding in search of memory. A Second Through the Air is inspired by my father's escape from an Auschwitz-bound train by diving into the Wiesel River. A second through the air, maybe two, or eternity, into the night, away from the train, toward the river, and then the bullets hit, arm, leg, forehead. He no longer feels, no longer hears, until the water jolts him awake, cradles him, forces him to return. He does not remember what he saw, whom he saw beyond, but knows that he cannot stay, that he must go on, that he must go back. Finally, allow me to conclude with three poems inspired by the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, by the COVID-19 pandemic, and by the accident on a Friday morning in August of 2019, which made me realize that my poems needed to become my spiritual legacy to my grandchildren. The Messiah will not come, God will not leave his seclusion until Jerusalem's bearded rabbis, imams, priests teach daily that each Jewish child, Palestinian infant, is created with one, only one, always the same divine spark. To our grandchildren from afar, alone and yet connected to you, alone but able to see, hear you on laptop screens, iPad, iPhone, to be with you without being next to you, laughing with you, watching Hallie dance, listening to Jake play his guitar, singing Shabbat prayers with you, celebrating the Seder with you, hugging you without touching you, apart but still together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu. Even in the time of coronavirus, we are blessed. And finally, a poem that has echoes of the poem that I read a few minutes ago about my father's escape from an Auschwitz-bound train. In the seconds after the truck hit me, I know what it is to almost die, to dread not to be able to finish all I've left to do, that I will never again kiss my best friend, my love, hug my daughter, my grandchildren, wish friends a good morning, a good year. Far too many thoughts, plans, dreams converge, begin to fade into black. And then when the truck stops, my foot under its tire, I sense a soundless whisper, perhaps within me, perhaps from somewhere far away, telling me, not today, not yet, but do not waste this gift, reprieve, this beginning of what could be my next chapter or my last. Thank you.
Sure, Menachem. That was absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
I mean, the poems are beautiful, but to hear the context and you read them is something really unique and special. And I don't agree with Adorno. I do think that you have been able to encapsulate Auschwitz in poetry in a way that so often is not able to be encapsulated in a film or in any other form of expression. Well done. I feel choked up. Your last three poems were particularly poignant for all of us and resonate deeply. So I want to, maybe I'm particularly intrigued in the faith in God, confronting faith in God with the reality of the Holocaust. And I know that you've done it, expressed it in poetry, but I wondered if you'd elaborate a little bit more about your thoughts with regard to where was God in Auschwitz. We've all wrestled with this question, and there are some simplistic answers, but I wondered if, other than your poetry, you had any wisdom, or you've given it a great deal of thought, and I'd be very interested to hear more from you.
Well, there is a kind of quick answer and a longer answer. The quick answer was given by my father, who was once asked whether he still believed in God after Auschwitz. And my father's somewhat facile but appropriate, I think, answer was, look, I don't hold God responsible for the Holocaust, but I'm not going to give him any medals for it either. In a real sense, I think that we all suffer from an arrogance in believing that we know God, that we know what God is, that we know, I mean, we have created, we as in a long 1,000-year-old tradition, have created the image of God who basically looks and acts like us, as in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But the reality is we have no idea, and no one has an idea. And it's whether it's a Christian God or a Jewish God or a Muslim God, we don't know. So we can either go into a kind of Nietzschean God is dead or atheist mode, or we can reconcile our belief that there is something divine in the world. And the way I've been able to basically relate to it, to adjust my thinking to it, is not in terms of God during the Holocaust, but rather the presence or absence of the divine. There is in Jewish mythical terms the concept of the Shekhinah, the divine spark. Well, I want to believe that this Shekhinah, this divine spark, was present in every Jew in the camps and ghettos who remained human to another Jew, to another inmate, to another human being, who comforted a child, who shared a piece of bread and gave away from his or her own rations in order to help ease someone else's hunger, who sang a song or told a joke, or just remained human. And that is true of Jews or those non-Jews who risked their lives to save other Jews. And at the same time, I believe that this divine spark was absent in the perpetrators. They did not have it. I cannot blame God for perpetrating the Holocaust, but I certainly can say that those who did, and those who watched, and those who did not help, did not have divine qualities. It's not the easiest answer, it's not a satisfying answer, but it's the one with which I've had to make do, because it's the one that enabled me to still believe in something. At the same time, I bristle when somebody, and I've had this conversation actually with survivors at times, because if somebody says, I thank God because I survived, I said, that's nice, but that means you also blame God for all those who did not survive. You can't have it both ways. If God helped one person survive, then God did not enable my brother to survive. This is a zero-sum solution if you want to do it that way. And so I prefer to move away and turn and look at divine qualities as opposed to an actual omniscient, omnipresent God who could have fixed it but didn't.
Thought-provoking, Menachem, thank you. I want to go back to your parents, because in the poetry, you're able to encapsulate the extraordinary hardship, whether it's your father jumping from the train into the river and being shot, or your mother's absolutely excruciating agony of losing her family and her precious 5-year-old. Yet both of them were able to go on and create a new life together. But in the early days of that life, they were able to give so much of themselves in support of those who had survived and were struggling. I mean, I want to just read a quote that your mother made at the speech in 1981 at the International Liberators Conference organized by the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. Hadassah Rosensaft recalled the grim reality of her first days of freedom. And I quote, "For the greater part of the liberated Jews of Bergen Belsen," she said, "there was no ecstasy, no joy at our liberation. We had lost our families, our homes. We had no place to go, nobody to hug." Sorry. Nobody was waiting for us anywhere. We had been liberated from the fear of death, but we were not free from the fear of life. And yet, within that fear, tell us a little bit about what they went on to accomplish and how they became a beacon of hope and love and liberation for so many.
Well, a little bit of context and background. My mother was a dentist. She had studied medicine before the war in France and was a dental surgeon. After arrival at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and after losing all but her sister, she wrote in her memoir that she was devastated until she ended up on a roll call in pouring rain for several hours, which brought her back to some sense of reality. Perhaps for her, the equivalent of my father hitting the water of the Vistula River and being brought back to consciousness. She was then assigned to the infirmary at Birkenau, where she was able to save the lives of countless Jewish women by performing rudimentary surgeries or getting them dressed and out of the barrack, out of the infirmary in advance of a selection by SS doctors or the like. I did not know this from her. I knew this because at innumerable gatherings of survivors that I went to with my mother, women came up to her and said, "Dr. Bimko," my mother's maiden name, "Dr. Bimko, you don't remember me, but you saved my life." And then they would tell the story. And then at Bergen Belsen, she and a group of other women kept 149 Jewish children alive through the bitter cold winter of 1944-45, despite horrific hygiene, total lack of hygiene, tremendous hunger, and a raging typhus epidemic. And I've always wondered what gave her the strength, what gave her the ability to do that. And perhaps it was the fact that her inability to save and protect her own child made her want to try and help and protect and save other children. After the liberation, Bergen Belsen was liberated on April 15, 1945. That was about 3 weeks before the end of World War II. The Brits had liberated Belsen purely by accident. They stumbled across it. It was actually the only camp that wasn't really liberated. It was turned over to them under a white flag in a truce because the Germans were afraid that the inmates would escape, and because of the raging typhus epidemic, that they would then infect all of Lower Saxony. And in any event, so the British were able to leave a skeleton medical team at Bergen Belsen, as I'm sure you know from some of the talks you've had about Belsen. But it was that, and they had 50,000 liberated inmates, the vast majority of whom were critically ill. So the chief medical officer there asked my mother to organize a team of doctors, I think there were 25 of them, and volunteers, 100 or 200, only a few were trained nurses, to work alongside the British medical team to try to save as many of the survivors as possible. And just as a point of reference, during the 2 months after liberation, close to 14,000, 13,944 to be exact, died after liberation. In order to stem the epidemic, what the British started to do about a week after the liberation, they started to move the inmates, to the extent possible, the liberated prisoners, from the barracks of the concentration camp to the nearby barracks about a kilometer away of a German Panzer tank training school. And they evacuated the German soldiers from there, and that became an emergency hospital where they relocated the sick and then everybody else. And then about a month after the liberation, they burnt down the barracks of the concentration camp in order to, because otherwise the typhus had completely infected all the wooden barracks. And that military base then became the largest displaced person camp in Germany. My father, meanwhile, had a kind of interesting period himself. After he dove out of the train, he made it back that night. Well, he was hit by several bullets. Coming out, he found a hut where a Polish peasant woman and her son took him in, let him dry his clothes, gave him some bandages and a cup of coffee and a hat to cover his quite bloodied head. And he made his way on foot back to the ghetto because he had nowhere else to go. There he was reunited with his father, and they spent another 6 weeks together until the final liquidation of the ghetto. My grandfather died in my father's arms of natural causes. He was 80, close to 80. And my father escaped to a nearby town, then was deported from there to Bergen Belsen, deported from there to Auschwitz. From there, he managed to get himself transferred in late 1943 to a labor camp near his hometown of Bergen, and there he escaped, as he described it to me once. He went out on a work detail and just walked away, and was hidden for several weeks by a Polish friend of his. He was then caught again by the Germans because he was trying to get false papers to get himself to Hungary, and the Germans stopped the tramway he was on. And they were looking for somebody else, and obviously with the number tattooed on his arm, they figured out quite quickly that he was an escapee. Beat him severely, brought him back to Auschwitz, where he was tortured for about 6 months in the notorious Block 11, the death block, where the Germans wanted him to give up the name of the person who hit him, which he didn't do, and which I believe saved his life. From there, in late 1944, he was taken to a subcamp of Buchenwald. From there to another subcamp, a place called Dora Mittelbau, where the V2 rocket were being manufactured. And from there to Bergen Belsen, where he arrived about 10 days before liberation, or thereabout. And at Bergen Belsen, he emerged very quickly as first the head. I mean, what happened with the survivors, there were two sets. One was in the main camp, that's where my mother was, and that's what the British called the horror camp. But about somewhere between 15 and 20,000 inmates whom the German brought from Dora Mittelbau to Bergen Belsen toward the beginning of April, even the SS couldn't fit them into the concentration camp anymore, because the camp had been originally built as a exchange camp, a transit camp for privileged Jews. It was in fact the only Jewish camp on German soil, because the Germans were deporting Jews from Germany, except Bergen Belsen was set up in 1943 for, shall we say, privileged Jews, Jews who they wanted to exchange for German prisoners in Allied hands and the like. It was built to accommodate somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 inmates. Well, by the time of liberation, there were about 50,000 there. And even the Germans couldn't fit any more. So when these 15 to 20,000 arrived from Dora Mittelbau, including my father, they were put into a number of barracks of what subsequently became the DP camp, the military barracks. That in the palms of the day was Camp 2, Lager 2. Well, the prisoners, the inmates in Camp 2 were the ones who were the healthier ones, because they were not in the horror camp, as it were. They were not infected by the typhus epidemic. And in very short order after the liberation, the different barracks basically elected committees to represent them in discussion with the British. What do we do next? How do we get home? How do we get out of here? Where do we get food? And we know they're collaborators. There are capos who are hiding among the inmates, or there's some Hungarian SS who were still shooting people even after liberation. These were so-called block committees. Those block committees then joined and created a unified committee. That then became the Jewish Committee, which then became the committee that effectively ran the displaced persons camp. And my father, from early on, became the head of that committee. He also later on in the spring, summer of 1945 rather, became the head of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in the British Zone of Germany, which included all the tiny Jewish communities that were coming back up with Jews who returned home, German Jews who returned home. And that's how he became and acted as the head of the survivors of Bergen Belsen and the British Zone. And he made a decision early on that he would not leave Bergen Belsen, although the British desperately wanted to get rid of him since he was a thorn in their side from the get-go on all kinds of issues, such as Palestine wanting to be classified as Jews, not as nationals of their countries of origin, refusing to let the British move them out of Bergen Belsen to other camps and the like. But he and my mother decided that they would remain until all the other survivors of Bergen Belsen had been resettled elsewhere. They met a few weeks after the liberation, married a year later, and as Mary mentioned, I was born in Bergen Belsen in 1948. That's a bit of the background of my parents.
Absolutely fascinating and inspiring stories. And I mean, what a legacy for you. You mentioned that Elie Wiesel was a mentor.
Yes.
Obviously, he was somebody that was well known to your parents. I'd love to know how that relationship.
Elie was a young writer who had written a book in Yiddish and then several books in French. He was a correspondent for an Israeli paper in New York, and also wrote for a number of Yiddish papers. And he and my father became friends, I guess, around shortly before my bar mitzvah. So I guess I must have been about 12 years old, something like that. And they became friendly. And he would come very, very frequently to our home. And of course, you know, conversation with my father, political discussions, joking. They both liked singing Hasidic songs. Elie from Visionitz from Hungary, my father Gera melodies from Poland. But Elie also always had an interest in young people. And he was always very solicitous of me and sort of, how are you doing? How is your school? How is everything going? It was sort of a pro forma conversation until one point, a few years in, I think I was must have been 16, 17 years old. I was still in high school. He asked, how are you enjoying school? How are you doing? So I said, everything is going well, except for an English seminar I was in. So he said, what's going on? What's the matter? I said, I'm not enjoying the course. He said, why? You like to read, you enjoy reading, you enjoy writing. I said, yes, but the teacher is bad. I'm not getting anything out of the course. So Elie was by nature skeptical. He said, I think you're exaggerating. Let me see one of the papers you've written, with his comments. So I showed it to him. He read it. He said, I see what you mean. You're not going to get anything out of that course. That class is not going to do anything for you. I said, okay, more or less thinking, tell me something I don't know. To which he said, but you have to pass the class and you have to get a good grade. Otherwise, it's going to have all kinds of implications. So he said, in that case, and this was somewhere around October of that year, pretty much close to the beginning of the school year. And he said, I'll tell you what, why don't you do what you have to in the class, both in terms of the reading, in terms of the writing assignment, whatever you have to do. Do whatever you have to do, then come and meet with me once a week, and we'll go over the exact same material, and I'll tell you what it's really about. And so for a year, I had a private tutorial with Elie in which we went over, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean plays, whatever it was that we had on my high school curriculum. And literally, that's how the two of us bonded because I got an insight into him intellectually and, quite frankly, learned the use of language and learned how to formulate language from him. And we then remained very close. I was his first teaching assistant when he started teaching at New York City College. And we remained very close friends until he died.
Amazing. What a privilege. What an extraordinary opportunity. And I'm not surprised he saw potential in you, Menachem, but how blessed you were. Did your parents talk a lot? I'm going to ask if anyone in the audience would like to ask any questions. I see that there is a question here just before just to clarify, earlier I thought your father was killed when he jumped from the train into the river and was shot, but that is obviously not correct. So no, I'm sure that's no,
what happened with my father was on a transport from his hometown to Auschwitz. He was there together with his wife and her daughter. He had married the widow of one of his close friends. And for some reason, they went not in a cattle car, but they were crammed into a regular passenger car. My father was a tremendous swimmer. He was a member of a sports club in his hometown. And he was urged to try to escape, maybe you can come. If you escape, maybe you can help us get others get out of there. So as the train crossed the Vistula, not far from Auschwitz, he dove out the window, and the SS who was sitting on top of the train shot at him. And there were 3 bullets. One grazed his forehead, one hit his arm, and one his leg. And the one his leg was too close to a blood vessel and therefore remained there until he died. And that was his survival of diving from the train.
I mean, the bravery to dive out of a train. I mean, one can't comprehend the courage, however much what you're once confronting, you always think, oh, well, maybe not. And it's just extraordinary. Carolyn's sharing a link of that she would like the audience to enjoy. Thank you, Carolyn. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to open the microphone. It's a fascinating legacy, Menachem. Do you obviously feel the privilege, but sometimes do you feel the burden of being what they would have hoped for you? And I just can't imagine the expectation of these parents who had so much heartache and had invested in you, they would be so proud of you. Do you
Well,
feel
thank
that?
you. I hope that. I feel that. I hope that. I think for the most part, it's not a burden. It is a responsibility. There is a difference.
Of course.
And I think for most of the survivors, certainly most of the survivors that I have known, they didn't really have expectations of their children in the sense of wanting them to do certain things. They wanted them to be safe. They wanted them to be secure, and they wanted them to have opportunities. I think that coming out of the gruesomeness of the Holocaust, they really wanted their children not to have to experience anything of the like. But at the same time, there was, certainly for my parents and for many of the other survivors that I've known, there was not a sense of, okay, we've survived, now nothing else matters. We just want to go on with our lives. There was a sense of responsibility toward others. My parents had a responsibility, felt a responsibility, both toward the other survivors and to the memory of those who perished. So that this is a legacy that I witnessed when they were alive, and I feel an obligation to continue. And yes, I do hope that they would be proud of what I'm doing, but I'm also doing it because I owe it to them.
And you're doing it so magnificently, and as I say, they would surely be proud. Without any other questions, I would like to close by reading Deborah Lipstadt's comment about your book. She says, ever since he was a college student and in the many decades since, Menachem Rosensaft has been raising difficult questions. He has rarely, if ever, turned away from a light that when truth and justice were at stake. That same honesty, conviction, and forthrightness are evident in these compelling poems. His passion about the horrors of genocide, prejudice, and hatred leaves the reader unsettled. And that is how it should be. Thank you so much, Menachem, for leaving us a little unsettled, but richer for having heard your magnificent story. And thank you for the wonderful work you're doing in continuing the legacy of your extraordinary parents and protecting the life of those who survived and honoring the memory of those who didn't. Thank you, everybody, for attending what was truly an inspiring hour. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thanks, Menachem.